Yeah, okay. So for my project, I wanted to research how organizations in schools support refugee students because I'm hoping in the future to either be an ESL teacher or work at a resettlement agency. So I started off my research by researching kind of what organizations that are already out there, what they're doing to support refugees. And so I found a couple of agencies, USCRI Vermont and the International Institute of New England, and both of those organizations, they offer adult ESL classes and they also place students in schools. And then I also looked at this larger organization, BRYCS. So they're an organization, they're kind of like the point person for these smaller organizations to reach out to if they need help with a case. And I looked into their, they have a toolkit out there for teachers who have refugee students in their classroom, and it kind of just answers a lot of frequently asked questions to help out teachers. So next, I was really excited to look at, I was really excited to look at also what schools and teachers are doing to support refugees in their classrooms. So there's a lot of resources online for teachers about like best strategies to use, but I wanted to look at kind of what strategies teachers are using in the classroom now and what works best. So I reached out to a few different teachers and it was really awesome talking with them because I want to be a teacher, and it was kind of just inspiring hearing how they support students. And so the first teacher I spoke with works at the International Institute of New England, and she teaches adult ESL classes. And that was interesting because all of my education classes in the past have been geared towards elementary school students. So it was really cool to hear that perspective of teaching adults. And so some ways that she supports students are she creates a sense of community in the classroom by having student-centered lessons and giving each student a voice. And another way is she has goal-oriented instruction. So basically just knowing what the students' goals are for the future and kind of adapting her lessons to meet their goals. So if they have different professional goals, she can make lessons relating to that. And another thing that she does is she targets different learning styles through visuals, audio, body language, and also she uses a individual as well as group instruction. So with group work, we talked a little bit about that because that's really important to giving each student a voice and creating this community in the classroom because they're all working together. And she has the mindset of, she said there are many teachers in a room. So basically, she was just talking about how with these group work, she can give everybody a voice. And it's also really helpful if there's a lot of different language abilities in the classrooms, which happens a lot with ESL classes. So with group work, she can kind of tailor it so that students are learning from each other and they all have a role in the group, whether one is a timekeeper, one is the writer. And then I spoke with another teacher who kind of has a different perspective. She has a first and second grade newcomer class. So she gets students throughout the year that are coming to the US. And so we talked a lot about creating a welcoming space for students, both physically and emotionally welcoming. So with creating a physically welcoming space, she talked about the importance of just simple things like having a name tag on the student's desk so that when they get there, there's a desk for them and they're like, oh, there's already a place here for me. And on creating an emotionally welcoming space, she talked about how important it is to just tell students that everybody in the class is learning English, they're all in the same boat, and the classroom is a place where everybody can just learn, make mistakes, laugh, and just accept everybody for who they are. And also she uses a lot of different literary medias to support students. So she gave one example of there's a lot on YouTube of books that authors and celebrities read, and there's YouTube videos of them. So she shows those to the students, and that gets them really excited about reading. And so next I wanted to also look at, in addition to like the organizations and teachers, I wanted to look at what community organizations are doing to support refugees and immigrants. So I specifically focused on local Tibetan community organizations because there's so many local organizations out there. And it was really interesting learning more about these because I didn't realize before how big of an impact they have. And so I looked at a couple different ones, specifically the Tibetan Youth of Boston, as well as Tibetan language schools. So the Tibetan Youth of Boston, it's basically this organization that supports youth in the Boston area, and they have different programs like a college program, a mentorship program, and they do different recreational events, volunteering. They discuss Tibetan literature. And I also looked into Tibetan language schools, which I didn't even realize were a thing, but they're throughout the US, and they're for kids. And basically they meet on the weekends, so from like around 9 in the morning to like 2 p.m., and they have Tibetan language classes in the morning, and in the afternoon they have traditional dance and singing classes. and And yeah, so I was talking with one woman about why these organizations are so important, and she was talking about how um, events like these kind of get the whole community together and encourage youth to talk with more members of their community. Like the Tibetan Youth of Boston, they have this event where they get together with the elderly in the community, and it just really gives youth a platform to just talk with more people and engage with their culture, language, and heritage. And also, these organizations are really integral to preserving this culture and heritage. And one quote from Kaesong, who I talked with. So she joined the Tibetan Sunday School program a few years after she came to the United States, and she just talked about how important it was to have Tibetan friends, and kind of just joining this organization helped her feel a sense of belonging and just a lot more secure in being in the US. And so the last part of my research, I wanted to hear people's memories of coming to the US, like with Kaesong, and both of the women I interviewed mentioned how awesome the English support that they received in the US was, and also how helpful the Tibetan communities in their cities were, and just to kind of help them feel a sense of belonging in the community, as well as these organizations offer a lot of services too. Like I know right now the Tibetan Youth of Boston, they're offering tutoring services online to kids in school, and also they're helping families file for unemployment. So just essentially the impact of these community organizations is huge. And yeah, so that's my project. Do you guys have any questions?
So who did you interview for your project?
So I interviewed a woman from the International Institute of New England, which is kind of like a refugee resettlement agency. So we talked about INE, as well as she teaches the adult ESL classes. And then I talked with another teacher and who has the newcomer class. And then I also spoke with so I reached out to the Tibetan Association of Boston, and they got me in contact with Kaesong, and she's like super involved with the Tibetan community in Boston. So she's one of the coordinators for Tibetan Youth of Boston. She attended the Sunday school, so we talked a lot about that. And also she's part of Students for Tibet. So that was really interesting because she's like around our age, so it was cool talking with her. And then I talked with a couple teachers who work at these Tibetan language schools and kind of learn more about kind of what that day-to-day looks like. And then I talked with another woman about coming to the United States and kind of what her experiences were like.
So the kids at the Tibetan language schools are mostly kids that were born in the US and grew up speaking English, but have Tibetan families that they haven't spoken Tibetan with?
Yeah, so it was kind of a mix. So I think now a lot of the kids in the schools are second generation immigrants, and
Mm-hmm.
Kaesong was talking about, as well as I interviewed another man, Nawang Gurung, about
Mm-hmm.
how a lot of parents are having difficulty keeping up the Tibetan language with their children, because a lot of them, if they're not kind of born into like a Tibetan community, like I know in Boston, it's kind of in like the Medford, Somerville area. So if they're not in these communities, a lot of their friends aren't going to be Tibetan, so they're not going to be speaking Tibetan, and
Mm-hmm.
they're speaking English at school. So that was kind of another reason that these language schools are like really helpful to the community. But yeah, I know Kaesong, she was not born in the US, and another woman I talked with also wasn't. So I think it is kind of mixed.
Mm-hmm.
did this project, given that you live in Boston, did this project make you want to get involved with the Tibetan community, or were you just like looking for a more recognizable framework? Is that why you like were interested in Boston stuff, or why were you thinking about that?
Honestly, I kind of just wanted to narrow it down just because there's so many organizations. And when I was talking with people, it kind of branched out also into like a couple schools in New York. But yeah, I definitely am really interested in it. And especially if I'm a teacher in the future, now I kind of understand like how important these community organizations are and like getting students in touch with them, especially if I'm working with new Americans. So I think, yeah, that's also really important. Okay, cool. Thank you guys.
Sorry, I'm trying to write down you Americans, but my phone is going into every other script. I think it's got excited by your presentation, Sarah. Between your presentation and Leah's presentation, the languages on my phone have just started going bananas. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Great job. And Leah, we'll go on to you now. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen as well. Okay. So is this working? Okay, awesome. So my project is called Identity Without Borders, Preservation of Tibetan Language, Culture, and Identity in the United States. So I was also looking at Tibetan communities in the US, so there are going to be some similar themes to what Sarah was talking about. So I'm just going to start by reading my abstract because I think that gives kind of the best overview of this. So as members of a generation of Tibetans in exile, Tibetan American youth in the United States face the challenge of preserving a language, culture, and identity which they've likely never been exposed to firsthand. Internal conflict in relation to linguistic and cultural identities, pressures from older generations, and political difficulties may appear as barriers to this goal. However, they've instead paved the way for new exploration of what it means to be Tibetan and how younger generations might be able to continue with preservation despite the very different lives they hold to previous generations of Tibetans. In the paper, I explored the themes through the narratives of 7 individuals who have navigated these difficulties firsthand. There we go. I'm just going to start kind of giving an overview of what it's like to grow up as a Tibetan American in the US. So first of all, as Sarah touched on too, you usually attend Tibetan language school on Sundays from a really young age, kind of up until the end of high school. And then in addition to that, a lot of people participate in like dance and music classes on the weekend as well. And then kind of as a wider community, there are a lot of celebrations that people do, such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama's birthday, March 10th, so Tibetan Uprising Day, Losar, His Holiness Dalai Lama's Nobel Peace Prize celebration, full moon days, weddings, and really the community gathers for like almost every possible event that they can. It's pretty involved. And then at home, a lot of families also kind of try to keep up these things. And a lot of people I spoke to had kind of rules set in place by their parents where they could only speak Tibetan at home. So most people do speak only Tibetan with their parents, although usually with siblings they'll speak English. So then kind of on the other side of it, a lot of these people, like they go to school Monday to Friday. At American schools, they have sports and extracurriculars, and usually at their schools there really are not other Tibetan students. And so they're kind of surrounded by only American and English culture and language. And then kind of by the time they reach high school age, you know, they start college applications, so they have SAT prep classes and more extracurriculars, as well as just general academic and social pressures. So they don't really have a lot of extra time, and a lot of people drop out of Tibetan language classes and weekend activities by the time they reach high school age, which is kind of unfortunate. Just kind of they're feeling more pressure to fit in and succeed as Americans, and kind of, you know, as a split to being Tibetan. So the idea of like just pressures in general really came up a lot when I was talking to people. And they kind of attributed this to the trauma that a lot of the elders in the community faced, especially since that was the generation that really went through a lot of the situation that happened in Tibet. And that's led to a lot of fear for them for the future of this community, of what it means to be Tibetan. And that kind of manifests as a lot of pressure placed upon the younger generations, and just miscommunication in general. And so a lot of the youth feel just tons of anxiety about this. And it leads to just really a big split between the two identities, trying to succeed in the American world, but also having the pressure to preserve an entire culture and identity in the Tibetan community. So this kind of preservation, there's a really, really big push from elders in terms of language preservation. And there are a few reasons why that's really important. One of them is that it's a really important mode of communication, especially between the generations, because a lot of the older community members still only speak Tibetan or just don't speak English very well. So the only way for them to kind of tell their stories and recount their memories from being in Tibet and talk about their culture and identity is through the Tibetan language. And then another thing is that having this across all Tibetans, not only in the US, but across the world, creates this really important aspect of identity, this like linguistic community of practice. So they have that kind of common aspect of their identity throughout all communities. And then another thing that was mentioned was how important language is for like religion and religious texts, because a lot of important religious texts are in Tibetan, and that's kind of the like what is described as like the most perfect translation of these texts. So in general, as I said, like Tibetan culture is really linked to Buddhism, and it creates this really important foundation for like preserving religion and philosophy, and just like that is a really important aspect as well that was mentioned to preserve. But in order to preserve that, you kind of need Tibetan language. And another thing is that because of policies that are in Tibet now, there really isn't a lot of linguistic freedom. So kind of the responsibility to preserve that lies on communities outside of Tibet, which again is a lot of pressure. And a big issue is that a lot of Tibetan American youth are not fluent in Tibetan because they only attend this class once a week from like until their high school age, and they don't really continue after that. So it's really tough. And even at home, like they'll throw in words that are like English words, and it's really just more like conversational than formal language, which has also led to more self-consciousness about speaking to others other than their family. So a really big thing is kind of thinking about like new ways to preserve their identity and culture, maybe other than language, because that really doesn't seem like something they can rely on right now. And something that I saw emerging a lot was this political platform in the US, because in the US they do have freedom of expression and like freedom to protest, freedom of like linguistic freedom, religious freedom. And so these big movements, the Free Tibet movement and the Middle Way movement, are really just like strengthening a lot. And there's kind of this idea of like, if they don't use this platform in the US or places where they do have this kind of freedom, then who's going to fight for them? Who's going to fight for Tibet? So there are a lot of youth and just people in general, Tibetan community members who are involved in these. And that kind of shows like the youth really do want to be involved. They really do want to be part of it. They do want to fight. And like they do feel the pressure to preserve it. They know that they have responsibility for that. And, even if they're really busy or cannot learn the language in the way that the elders want to, then, they still can do it in a really important way. I actually have heard a story about someone who went to the March 10th protest in New York City last year, and it just kind of was really powerful story that she was telling. These are some pictures she sent me from it. And it just was really interesting because I think this picture too, you can kind of see in the distance, like there are so many people there. And I really didn't realize how like big, not only this movement, but this community is in the US. And this is only one of the cities. There are multiple really large populations of Tibetan communities. So that was really, really interesting to hear about. And just how important the freedom is, because like also not only in Tibet is there lack of freedom, but also Nepal, I think, is kind of growing resistance. It's a high risk to participate in protests because the police are really like, they do a lot of arrests, they kind of beat you up sometimes, and so that isn't something a lot of people participate in. So that was just really interesting to see kind of this expression and how like as the lifestyle and language is shifting, they're like the identity is shifting as well, and there are these newly emerging ways that might not necessarily be what the elders are expecting in terms of preservation, but it's not really necessarily for the worse, it's just really different. Yes, that's my project.
Thank you, Leah. So, questions for Leah, please. We're getting lots of applause. Felicitations.
I also like I did a lot more research into like linguistic things like code switching, multilingualism, stuff like that I just didn't really cover in this. So if there are questions about that, I can talk about it.
What was an interesting example of code switching you wrote about in your paper?
Yeah. So generally, like a lot of people were talking about kind of different like roles that they hold in different languages that they speak, and how it's not really something they actively think about a lot. Just it kind of happens because they grew up. I mean, kind of being part of a Tibetan community, you have to be multilingual. I mean, not only in the US with like Tibetan and English, but really anywhere in Nepal with like Hindi and Nepalese. Like that's, yeah, you kind of have to know more than one language to be part of that. And a lot of people explain kind of this like different way that you think in different languages. And one of them, different ways you express yourself. And one of them talked about how like in Tibetan, a lot of people talk about like your weight very openly, which I found was really interesting because that's something like that we kind of talked about when we were in Nepal and experienced, and how like that's just totally fine in that language, in that thought process, but in English and with Americans, you really can't express things in that way and talk about that stuff.
Wait, what did you say? Express things in your way?
Sorry.
What did you say? What was the thing you said is very different? You said a word that was I couldn't hear.
Oh, I don't remember. I'm sorry. Just kind of expression in general.
Wait, you're talking about weight.
Talking about weight. That's what I didn't hear.
Saying you're fat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that's what I didn't hear.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Exactly. Yeah. Anyways, that was just really interesting because it's kind of like, you know, like the things that you can say, that the different people you're talking to, you express yourself in different ways in different languages.
Wonderful, Leah. Thank you very much. And I look forward to talking to you more, in person. So now, Aidan, please.
Great. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So my project, which is kind of, it's not provisionally entitled. I mean, Dharma and Doctorates, because I made it the final title, but like I think it's still a little punchy. I don't know. I don't know what really the word punchy means, but the title, it can be a discussion if someone has other good, idea. But basically, I include this framing photo. It's the cover photo of my ISP. Because it is a photo from one of the Tsadra Foundation conferences, and if you read the project, I don't speak about the Tsadra Foundation much explicitly in the presentation, but this is a large site of a lot of these sorts of tensions and conflicts and balances that I'm talking about in this project. The person like right of the person wearing the red robes in the center is Donald Lopez, who wrote Prisoners of Shangri-La. So, you can kind of see that's him there. So that's kind of a fun thing. So we kind of know some of these people who are engaged in these conversations. So my paper begins with a prologue, basically. Oh, you're seeing my screen. You're seeing me drag you around, aren't you? Yes? No? Okay, great. Awesome. But basically, the prologue begins with the sort of quote, which is, "We used to not be taken seriously in Buddhist studies. Now that's all changing." And it's kind of like ominous and expresses a bit of like disdain for the past, but also like a respect and hope for the future. I think like this I took as the grounding quote. I heard this from someone who's involved with the Rongjung Yeshe Institute, our neighbors down the road, from Yantra House. And this as both an accredited institution to give someone their BA or MA in Buddhist studies, as well as still being a functioning monastery under Choki Nyingma Rinpoche, is kind of an interesting place for thinking about these kinds of issues, because it's expanding sort of this larger idea of like study and practice and seeing how they can work with each other as concepts. So RYI is an interesting place that I bring up a little bit in the project, but basically someone who believes it important that someone both have a critical study of Buddhism in like an academic sense, as well as be a practitioner of Buddhism, told me this quote: "We used to not be taken seriously in Buddhist studies. Now that's all changing." So this is sort of the introduction that I had to this really important group of people that sort of center my work, which is I refer to as scholar-practitioners, who are sort of involved in both this realm of critical study, but also devotional practice. And I was sort of interested in getting a sense of how they saw things, what they thought their role was in the setting, and how they are seen. And also, there's a lot of questions that I kind of took from this idea, like this sentiment. Okay, so sort of my like launchpad narrative and guiding questions then. So these are just sorts of the things that I was thinking about with that kind of line, like who's this we that used to not be taken seriously, why, what changed. This is sort of a reference to which I learned later is a reference to a general stigma, where like in American universities at one point in time, and still some people say today, but it's less evident. If someone were to be involved in Buddhist studies, but were to be seen or open themselves up as a practicing Buddhist, their idea that they could do like quality scholarship and a lot of like objectivity, which is a really important theme of this paper, would be then subsequently called into question. So they'd no longer be seen as a form of valid scholar. So clearly this person from RYI feels like that's different. But why is that different? And then I kind of used this sort of change that is perceived as a jumping off point to think about ways that study and practice could be separate and like what this really means. Because I personally think, and as this paper sort of asserts, I think the scholar practitioner is uniquely situated in a really interesting place within a particular context to do like a lot of what I interpret to be good. So that's sort of what I'm positing. The sort of like launchpad narrative that I refer to here is that I thought this project was going to be about like a fusion between study and practice and how the groups are becoming the same, like the scholar group and the practitioner group. And actually what I found was not the case in many different ways. There are still these sorts of divisions in different ways that they're categorized that are really, really important. So a lot of my paper is documenting both different ways that these divisions exist, as well as sort of personal stories of both tensions and personal stories of collaborations between the two. So my sort of like methods that I have is I conducted 10 interviews of 9 different individuals. They were all virtual interviews. And also it's important to take in mind that I was using snowball sampling. So it was a lot of someone who I talked to. I'd ask, who do you think I should talk to about this? And they would sort of refer me to the next person I should speak with. And there was some, diverging from that. But for the most part, it was really great because all these people were sort of wanting to get me in touch with all these other people, which was really lovely. But in some ways resulted in me talking to a lot of scholar practitioners. I didn't get the voice of someone who is just a hardline scholar. who is not a practitioner. So that's like a hole in my project. And I was also kind of, did not get to speak to as many practitioners, just practitioners who aren't involved in the world of scholarship as I would like. But I still think I spoke to a lot of interesting people. Also, something that I just want to take a moment to establish is that like relationships between study and practice are really variant depending on context and where one finds themselves in context. So like this is just to say that my interlocutors who I spoke with are a very highly specific group of people. They're all like ethnically white. I use that in quotations because that's like a, that's taking a bunch of different identities and potential diversities and kind of making them a monolith, but to use that as a label. And all have at least started a graduate program. So there's something about the fact that, this is like a pretty specific slice of people in America, and what I'm saying is this is not to be the norm of experience. And in the paper, I try to be diligent about the fact that I'm differentiating between the representation of a Buddhism in America and not making this labeled as American Buddhism. Yeah. And also there are myriad contexts in which study and practice can interact differently, both presently and historically. So just important to know that this is like one slice from the view of a group of people who I spoke with. And I just think that's very important to assert. Okay. And then sort of there are multiple sections of the paper in which I'm establishing different differences, telling various stories and things, but largely this is sort of the culminating bit of my paper, where there's not that much written about scholar practitioners in America as a category. And the literature that is written about them is largely by this one scholar practitioner named Charles Prebish, who was able to I spoke with and also emailed him a couple times. And he has a lot of different articles out, but sort of how he, as of 2012, saw the scholar practitioner role was he used this term quasi-monasticism, which I personally don't necessarily agree with using that term. I think that kind of has a weird sense to things. And in a recent email, he has actually said that the term might be a bit overenthusiastic. He was like, well, actually, these are lay practitioners. So to use the term monastic evokes a sort of Orientalist bent to it, basically, is what he was saying. And I think I would agree with him. So he's recently kind of revised, even though he doesn't have that in big writing. But essentially what he saw at the time that he was writing this article was that the scholar practitioner in American, largely white convert contexts, there's a notable lack of a monastic population to sort of educate the Tibetan Buddhist population, or the people following Vajrayana Buddhism. So in lack of this, he saw that the scholar practitioner could serve as a sort of quasi-monastic who would have both knowledge of the tradition as well as a personal commitment to the tradition and access to these communities. So that was at least his understanding. And a lot of people I spoke with kind of asserted that in this way, these personally connected scholar practitioners are really useful because they can make interventions within how convert practitioners in America are experiencing this sort of teaching and context, and they can be made familiar with other contexts through the role of scholar practitioners. But one of the reasons why I don't think quasi-monasticism is the proper term for it is that I don't think that the role of scholar practitioners should be to make interventions into the content of Dharma teachings, but rather more sort of anthropological interventions and a widening of history and various contexts. So that's just a way that I see it personally. But sort of an interesting thing that I also note in my paper is that there's a sub-theme of monastic elements that still play a role for some scholar practitioners. So for example, there's a forum online called Ask the Acharya, in which I don't even this guy, basically people send him questions about Buddhism and he responds in a little online forum. And he's, a white American man. different scholar practitioners within practitioner contexts are given titles like Lopon or Kempo, and they can sometimes play, and these are different people, and they can sometimes play particular roles within their own respective practitioner communities. So it was interesting to me that this monastic sub-theme kind of struck a chord in some scholar practitioner contexts, but not all. And then lastly, what my paper sort of tries to posit and kind of play around with the idea with is that the scholar practitioner, as I've sort of defined it, can serve to both intervene and play an outreach role in an academic world that now doesn't have, I would say, no longer has a false sense of like an objective truth that exists. So like with the scholar practitioner, you see this microcosm in which subject and object of academic study have actually collapsed. And I think this is an interesting idea in which, like, you know, I don't think you can exist separate of your positionalities. And I think like the scholar practitioner is an interesting way to think with this idea, and can be really, really useful. And like a large subcurrent of my paper also that I didn't get to touch on here is collapse of stigma and collapse of this, you know, false idea of objectivity. So that's what I have to say for now.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Aidan. Look, Bob is here.
Hey, Bob.
And Tashila.
Hey, Tashi.
How amazing. And lots of applause for you, Aidan. So would anybody like to say anything? Okay, so now, thank you, Aidan. You've clearly floored everybody, or everybody is agreeing with you. Total agreement with you.
All right. Are we good on shared screen? Okay, wonderful. So my project is called If You Can't Stop, Smile As You Go By, Road Tripping Across Kansas, Discover the Stories Behind Our Weird Roadside Attractions. So a quick note on the title. This project was kind of as much me trying to find a light within the darkness of being sent home from Nepal to a place that I wasn't that excited to return to. And so on one of my road trips, I drove through a small town whose welcome to Claflin sign said, if you can't stop, smile as you go by. And that just really stuck with me. And I don't know, it felt deeply connected to kind of one of my aims of this project, which was trying to find the smiles within this time. So anyways, for this project, I ended up visiting 28 roadside attractions, which you can see some of them in this kind of collage here, over the course of 5 road trips. And I drove a total of 1,560 miles for the project. And I wish I had time to tell you about all of these places. So I think as kind of will be a theme throughout this short presentation, if you want to know more, let me know and I'll gladly send you along my ISP. So the methodology behind this project happened in 2 parts. So first, I researched and then visited the attractions, and at the sites, I would journal a little bit about each of them, and then I would take photos. And I included these journal entries and photos of all 20 attractions in my final product. After that, the second part was I picked out 9 of these attractions with particularly interesting people or stories involved, and then I created poems, collections of poems, and short fiction about them. So some of these are creatively rendered to be as accurate to the truth as possible. Some take a few details and construct a story that represents just a truth, and some are born out of my own personal experience. So to start off, I'll start with a poem born out of kind of my own personal experience, which relates to the world's largest ball of twine. So the world's largest ball of twine is located in Cocker City, Kansas, and it has a really interesting backstory. And I wish I could go into it because it's been in competition for the world record ever since its inception. But I don't have time to go into it. So if you want to know more about kind of its backstory, it's referenced in the poem, but if you want to know more, let me know and I'll send it along. So anyways, this poem is called I'm an Organ Donor, So Please Harvest. When I die, I'm an organ donor, so please harvest. And you take my heart out of my chest, please replace it with a ball of twine. Only sisal twine will do. If anyone tries to put nylon twine in my body, like that dumbass imposter ball in Branson, slap them silly. If anyone tries to put string in my body, like those fucking Missouri wannabes who of course tried string after all their other failed largest ball of whatever attempts, my goodness, chop off their hand. Drive my body to Cocker City, Kansas, and touch my dead fingers against the twine ball there. You need to see how a twine ball's done right. Obviously, the largest won't fit inside me, but if you drive home over all those messed up Kansas roads with my dead body in the trunk going thud, 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 make a pit stop in the town of Lucas. Stop at 214 South Main Street to see if they might have the perfect sized ball for my empty chest cavity at the world's largest collection of the world's smallest versions of the world's largest things. Unless you're looking for a twine ball for my dead body, I wouldn't recommend going there. It sounds so cool, and I know you'd get your hopes up, but it's just a white and red striped bus that probably hasn't left that unremarkable piece of grass in a decade. So that's the first poem, and kind of move on to a very, very different note. This is the National Memorial to Fallen Educators, located on the Emporia State University campus in Emporia. So as I did research about this site, I was just deeply moved by the expanse of names of educators who have been killed in the line of duty. And I knew a single poem wouldn't be able to just do this expanse justice. So I created a collection of poems, all based on the truth of what happened to each of these individual or to some of these individuals. So each poem within the collection is titled by the names of the educators who have been killed in a single event. And I'll read 5 poems from the collection, and the collection is titled Final Days at School. Louise Arnold, Laura Elizabeth Bell, Linnie Raines Butler, Maisel Laureen Hannah, Lena J. Jacobs Hunt, Johnny Marie Purcell Nelson, Maddie Queen Price, William Hall Willie Tate, Louise Waller. The day a Texas school exploded was the day in 1937 when 9 teachers and 284 students died in an accidental blast. That's 293 dead people if you do the math. The building seemed to lift in the air and then smash to the ground. The explosion was heard 4 miles away. Elbert Wattenbarger. Mr. Wattenbarger was about to whip a 15-year-old boy for throwing stones. Don't you think he's a little old for that? But the boy pulled a knife and stuck it through his teacher's heart. Don't you think he's a little young for that? Miss Shockley. Miss Shockley walked out of school with 4 small children. One man approached her and shot her dead. He threw himself under a train that night. Kim Riddle. School bus took a sharp left turn over a concrete median. The bus hit another bus and flipped onto its side. When Riddle realized what was happening, she threw herself over one of her students, saving his life. Russell Jean Hampton. Miss Hampton, a Texas school bus driver, dropped off her students at Dick Dowling Elementary Thursday morning. On her way home, she saw one of her usual 10-year-old boys on his bicycle. He'd missed the bus earlier that day. Police speculated that Miss Hampton had told the boy to get on the bus with the intention of returning him to school and possibly reporting him for truancy. Instead of getting on the bus, the boy shot Miss Hampton in the head. She died from her injuries several days later. So again, if you'd like to read the whole collection of poems from that piece, let me know and I'll send it along. And finally, I'm moving on to one of the most interesting stories I learned from this project. So Boston Corbett is the man who killed John Wilkes Booth, who was the man who killed President Abraham Lincoln. So because of this, Boston Corbett is often referred to as Lincoln's Avenger. And after killing Booth, Boston Corbett moved to Kansas and lived in Dugout, which is a hole in the ground near Concordia, Kansas. And the local Boy Scouts troop erected this memorial that I visited to Boston Corbett. Yet what I learned that was most interesting about Corbett's story wasn't so much what happened in Concordia, but what happened in another area of Kansas. So after living in Concordia, he moved to my hometown and the state capital of Topeka, and he worked at the state house until one day he pulled a gun and was sent to the Kansas State Insane Asylum, also located in Topeka. So one day, as he was roaming the asylum's grounds with other inmates, he saw a horse tied up to a gatepost nearby and got on it and rode away, never to be seen or heard from again. And I just found that story so fascinating. So I decided to write a short story based on the few details I could find, and then centered on a fictional guard, the fictional guard who presumably in the story let Corbett get away. So I'll read the opening to this short story. It's set on May 26th, 1888, and it is titled Losing Lincoln's Avenger. Cravens was out walking with the 12 men in Group 2 from B Ward. The asylum only allowed 12 inmates per one guard during their allotted afternoon outside time. Even then, Cravens always had concerns. 12 unshackled men was a lot to look after. Sure, he was armed with a Smith & Wesson, and they were not, but it was always in the back of his mind. The fact that he even considered this, though, reassured him that he was good at his job. Some of the other guards, take Stafford for example, would just sit on the steps and light up a pack of smokes while the inmates wandered around as they pleased. Cravens was amazed no inmates tried to make a break for it when Stafford wasn't looking, but well, most of them were lunkheads anyways. Craven's wife Laura had taken a deep-seated interest in his job ever since a few months back when someone famous got assigned to Craven's ward. She frequently asked more about how Lincoln's Avenger was doing than her own husband. Cravens wasn't supposed to tell anyone about the inmates he watched over, but having the Boston Corbett, the famed Lincoln's Avenger in B Ward, well, he couldn't help sharing this with Laura. "Do you think he's really insane?" Laura asked one night over dinner. "I'm not so sure," Cravens responded. "I mean, he's here for a reason, right? I heard that supposedly he pulled a gun in the State House, and that's what got him in here. And I'd believe it. I mean, I can see how he's a little off. I hear him talking to himself and calling himself the Patriot when I walk by his cell. And he does have quite the temper. But I don't know, he also seems to have his wits about him. He's not a goop by any means." Cravens often found himself cataloging Boston's every move during their walks outside in the afternoons, eager to return home in the evenings with new stories for Laura. He'd plan these conversations in his head while the inmates talked amongst themselves. It's not like the inmates ever discussed anything much of interest anyways. Most of them couldn't even form a full thought in their heads, much less hold a real conversation. Plus, there were the really off-their-rockers ones, like Paul Matson, whose only communication was short squeals where his eyes would get really big and he'd tilt his head back to be parallel with the ground and then snap his head back into place after the brief howl. Or William Shepard, who was always wringing his hands and never spoke a word. Or George Stone, who would blab on and on about all the gold the Indians secretly hid all over the Kansas prairie, and by golly, if he could only get out of this damn place, he'd get to digging, and he'd be rich in no time. So due to time, I will stop there. And again, if you're interested in that story, let me know and I'll send it along, but I'll open it up to questions now.
Amazing, Avery, yeah.
I'm curious, did this project, because you said it kind of coming home, trying to look for things like those smiles, did it make coming home maybe easier in some ways than you had thought it would be?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Part of it is just having kind of goals every day, I think, and being able to construct my own schedule around, I'm visiting these 5 attractions today, getting to listen to podcasts while I was driving around Kansas, and learning so much. I really was shocked that I didn't know so many of these stories. Like I learned about that the pig that inspired the piggy bank was from Kansas, and that was a cool story. So I felt like between actually seeing the places, learning about them, and then creating pieces that were fun and I was happy with, that really made being home a lot better.
Not a single flower clock, Avery. I'm gonna cry.
Okay, well, on that mournful note, let's go to Anna to the birds. Thank you, Avery. Over to you, Anna, please.
Okay, let me, yes, okay. So, my project was about public involvement in bird conservation in the Missouri Ozarks and Nepal. And so I wanted to look at how the public is involved in bird conservation and look at different initiatives and organizations in both places. And I was also curious about the birders themselves and why people participate in these projects, and also what impact birding has on them personally. So as a quick intro to the Ozarks, since a lot of you probably don't know a lot about the Missouri Ozarks, I looked at Missouri specifically, but it also includes parts of Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And this picture on the right is at a state park in Missouri. And so there's lots of deciduous forests, hills and valleys, glades, and lots of caves. There's a lot of important protected habitats for birds in Missouri, like state parks, wild areas, and conservation land. And the state is also home to about 435 bird species, including the eastern bluebird, which is on the top of the screen, and that's our state bird. And bird watching has also been growing in the state for a lot of years. But there are a lot of threats to birds in the Ozarks, like large-scale land use change, habitat loss, pesticide misuse, and climate change, which is affecting the different ranges of birds in the Ozarks. And so that makes bird conservation all the more important. So for Nepal, a lot of us know kind of more about the geography of Nepal since we were there. But in terms of birds and habitat, there's 20 protected areas and 12 buffer zones around these. That makes up about 23% of Nepal's land. And there's also 27 important bird areas that are designated. So this provides really important habitat. And as in the Ozarks, bird watching has been growing in Nepal for many years, but I thought it was interesting that bird studies in Nepal were mainly started by foreigners, but then after 1990, Nepali ornithologists account for almost 80% of new bird species discovered in the country. So now it's really being taken over by Nepali ornithologists and birders, and I thought that was really cool. So Nepal is home to about 9% of the world's bird species, which is more than 886 species, including the national bird of Nepal, which is pictured on the bottom, the Himalayan monal, which is a gorgeous bird. I wish I could have seen one. But 42 of Nepal's bird species are globally threatened, and 167 are nationally threatened. So some of these threats are things like habitat destruction, unmanaged tourism, population growth, pollution, and climate change as well. So again, bird conservation is really important. So after kind of looking into the differences in regional differences, I wanted to look at the initiatives and some of the organizations themselves. So for the Ozarks, I looked at Greater Ozarks Audubon Society and the Missouri Department of Conservation. And there's so many things going on with these groups in relation to birds and conservation, but I wanted to look more specifically at what involves the public. So for Greater Ozarks Audubon, they hold monthly meetings. They have a really extensive field trip schedule that's free and open to the public when there's not a global pandemic. They also do a lot of habitat restoration projects that people can get involved in, and a lot of different school visits to teach people about birds. So one project that I looked at was the South Creek Restoration, which is in Springfield, Missouri, which is where I'm from. And it was this area near a trail in Springfield that was this like concrete stormwater drainage off a trail. It was pretty ugly. And then the Audubon Society worked really close with the city to restore it to native wetland habitat. So that's been really beneficial for birds and rainwater runoff. And it's been a really great project. And I also thought it was interesting that there were a lot of projects that didn't specifically focus on birds, but that were more focused on habitat or other parts of the ecosystem. So I really saw this recognition of helping birds helps the ecosystem as a whole, and vice versa. And then this picture on the left is from one of the bluebird nest box trails in Springfield. And so Audubon also helped to construct these in the late 80s and early 90s. And as bluebird populations were declining, a lot of it was because they didn't have nesting places to nest. And so they helped install these nest boxes that has been really successful and helped the bluebird populations recover. And then along with Audubon, I also looked at Missouri Department of Conservation and some of the citizen science projects that they coordinate in the state, like the Breeding Bird Survey and Eagle Watch. And so both of these are really volunteer-based. Volunteers are recruited to collect data about migrating bird populations, bald eagles in the state. And then this data is uploaded to databases, and it helps inform conservation efforts and legislation. And it's really important to helping to track the status and long-term trends of bird populations. So that was the Ozarks for a real quick overview. And then in Nepal, I looked at Bird Conservation Nepal, which is one of the leading bird organizations in Nepal, the Pokhara Bird Society, the Nepal Owl Festival, and the Asian Waterbird Census. So the picture on the right is of a bird survey in the Pokhara Valley. So for Bird Conservation Nepal, as with the Ozarks, I really could have done like a whole ISP just on this organization, but I really had to narrow it down to just a few of the initiatives that they're involved in. And specifically, I wanted to look at ones that were related to public engagement. So in 2017, BCN helped construct a bird and biodiversity conservation learning center at the Ranabari Community Forest near Kathmandu. So this has been a really beneficial way of raising public awareness, along with some things like more citizen science oriented bird counts that they help coordinate, like the sparrow count, which we do that annually. And it's just 20 minutes of people's time, and they recruit volunteers via Facebook. So that's been a really good way to raise awareness about bird conservation in Nepal. The Pokhara Bird Society is a lot smaller than BCN, but it does a lot of the same things in terms of organizing bird counts, connecting people via Facebook, and publishing various publications about bird conservation. So they host one event that I thought was really cool is the Pokhara Bird Fair, which brings people, government officials, media, and birders together in the Pokhara area. And so again, raise public awareness, and people can play games. There's different like poetry competitions, and so that's a really cool event. And another event that's really similar to the Pokhara Bird Fair is the Nepal Owl Festival, but it's a lot bigger. And this is another event that's really important in raising public awareness, and it is held annually as well. And I should have put a picture in here of the Owl Festival because it's really cool. There was like a picture of someone dressed in a really big owl costume. So it's fun. They do games, and also like poetry competitions, and they bring a lot of people together to help raise public awareness about specifically owl conservation, but also bird conservation. And finally, in Nepal, one of the people that I talked to was the national coordinator for the Asian Waterbird Census, which is done annually in January. And it's similar to like the Breeding Bird Survey and Eagle Watch, where volunteers go out and collect data about water birds in Nepal. But it's also done in 27 other countries in Asia and Australasia. So this data, again, gets used to help inform different conservation initiatives and legislation. So looking at these two regions, one thing that I really found was that public involvement in these bird conservation efforts is crucial to their success. And that also citizen science is really important in providing like really essential data that is helping to inform conservation initiatives and legislation. So that was the initiatives. And then just briefly, before my time runs out, I wanted to go over the birders that I looked at. So I love these pictures. I think birding pictures are funny with everyone looking up in their binoculars. But so I talked to several different birders, just kind of about their stories, how they got into birding, why they bird, and like kind of how it impacts them personally. And some of the things I found with these stories, the main difference was in people's background and how they got into birding. And I thought it was really fascinating that so many different paths can lead to that same passion for birds and bird conservation. And then some notable similarities that I also found really interesting was, I think I mentioned this before, but this recognition that birds are connected to the ecosystem as a whole. And so that working to protect habitats also protects birds, and protecting birds helps protect habitats and other species, which I thought was really cool. And then kind of along with that, also this recognition that the work that these people are doing through birding and through bird conservation is having an impact beyond just personal interest, whether it's contribution to science or impact on communities and other impacts beyond themselves. A lot of birders recognize that as well. And finally, an issue that I didn't really talk too much about in my paper, but that came up in almost every interview I did, was the impact of technology, and just how databases like eBird, new cameras, apps that people have on their phone that they can just access really quickly has really changed the world of birding and made it more accessible. And I thought it was cool too that it was technology and those things that allowed me to do this research and connect with birders in Nepal. So that was my project.
Well, wonderful, Anna. Thank you. Yeah. Really nice to do a bridging comparative project like that. So who would like to engage with Anna?
Anna, did you get to do some birding in Missouri?
Yeah, so I did a little. I was really sad because they did have to cancel all of the Audubon events that were planned for the spring, but those are usually really cool. But I did go out some on my own and do just like a little bit of birding. I'm not a great birder, but it's fun to go out and, you know, take a walk and just see what birds you can find. I've done some backyard birding too.
Did you find the birders to talk to for your project?
For birders in the Ozarks, I know like a lot of people who bird in the Ozarks, so I kind of just like started texting and sending emails, and they were really easy to find. But Nepal was harder. I did not get to email or to interview as many people as I had hoped, but I emailed like Bird Conservation Nepal and some people from the Asian Waterbird Census, and then Facebook was really useful in getting some people just like messaging random people from bird groups on Facebook, and some people, even if they didn't do an interview, still shared some useful information with me.
So I think we should go on to the last presentation. Max, are you the end? Yes. Please let the end begin.
All right. So I'll share my screen in a second after I talk for a couple minutes, but and also you guys are here, that's why I'm looking here with the cameras here. But essentially, yeah, so I was really bummed about the end of the semester, and when I got home, I just had no interest in doing any of the projects I had ideas about in Nepal, because I just thought that the whole time I'd just be bummed about not being there and just thinking about that the whole time. So I wanted to create a project that was and I almost considered dropping the ISP portion of the program. So I wanted to create this project that is very unique to this situation and taking advantage of this absolutely bizarre time that we're living in, and also take advantage of not take advantage of the people, but of the network and friends that I've made over the past 3 semesters being outside of the US. So what I did was, and this is when I will share my screen, but essentially, yeah, again, if I talk about all this in the video, but if there's one thing I learned when at first, you know, we all look very different when you look at people halfway across the globe. We really are all the same in a sense. So that's why I want to create this project and to show that. So all good? Thumbs up? Okay. So this is the message that I sent to everyone. So after I reached out to them, and then I confirmed that they're still residing wherever I thought they were. And then as long as they're outside the US, I asked them if they were interested, and if they were, then I sent them this message as like my more official instructions. So could you please send a horizontal selfie video of you answering the following questions and whatever comes to mind. Where are you now? How are things there generally? Do you know someone with the virus? What is your daily routine like now because of this lockdown situation? How do you expect the situation to develop in the future? And what's one piece of advice that you'd like to give to other people? So I sent this, and then when people asked, when do you need it by? This was the biggest mistake of my project. I told them May 1st because I thought I might as well give them a few weeks. It's not going to take too long to edit. I'll do it the week and a half before. If you ever think that like doing a creative project or something is a way out of a research paper, that's absolutely not the case. And I thought it would be about the same amount of work. I probably put about 3 to 4 times as much time in this project than I ever would writing a paper. So it was definitely labor intensive in that sense. But so I sent that out. And then once all the videos started rolling, I received a few up to the last day. So it was a continuous process, but very generally speaking, when I received them all, I then put them all into the Final Cut Pro, which I'll show you a screenshot of in a second. And then two of the videos submitted from my homestay, Amala, and then Lam Dorji, which was one of our co-researchers in India. Their videos were in Tibetan, so I needed a little help with translation. So I asked one of our resident experts with the Tibetan language to help me with that. So Tashi and I struggled a little bit the first few times trying to figure out the best way to do it. But then we eventually made a productive way to do the translations. This is a screenshot of Final Cut Pro. So I had used iMovie previously for some projects and I used to make recruiting videos for kids playing baseball. So I knew how to use iMovie, but I knew that with the size of the project and with the intricacy and the things that I wanted to do, that wouldn't be too great. So I looked at Final Cut Pro. I Googled it knowing that I was like, wow, I might shell out $300 for this just because I want to do it right. And maybe I'll use it in the future. But luckily there was a 90-day free trial from Apple. So that's what I've been using it on. So I have to pay for that. So you can just kind of see here, these are just some things. So this was the timeline here. So I had to stack all the clips. And then this is about halfway through the project. So then I had to put all the captions up here. The audio editing was one of the most frustrating parts because when you're collecting all these different clips, they're all different levels of volume. So I had to try to some extent, equal them all out. So you wouldn't be leaning into here and then all of a sudden someone is speaking very loudly at you. Over here, this is the index that I use basically. So what I did was when I received the clips, I clipped them up into different parts that I knew I'd be able to use in the future. And then also, if you do watch the video, you'll see that it's a very rapid succession, that there's no breaks so I eliminated all verbal crutches, likes, for the most part. And then once I had all those clips, then I named them by the city or country name and then number. And then I had these notes or these keywords of...
Max, I don't want to interrupt you, but we can't see your slide on the whole screen. I don't know if that's your intention.
So you're seeing...
We're seeing all your slides. So
okay.
it just means we're not getting that detail.
Sure. How's that?
Yeah, that's it. Bingo.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, so you can kind of see these keywords here. So then when I started to mentally make this outline of how I wanted to organize everything, it was much easier to just plug in these keywords and then find these small clips. So yeah, I did that. And then it took, again, a very, very long time. It was this past week, the sleep schedule was messed up. It was legitimately wake up, start cranking on it, go to bed at 2. It was about 12 hours a day because I really wanted to get it done in time. So now the video is on YouTube. So I will send the link in the WhatsApp to everyone. So yeah, speaking about my video, I want to give a little bit about the background of making it. But I think it'd just be better to save a few minutes of everyone's time, and I'd rather have you go watch it than talk about it, because I've tried to play it on Zoom last night to test it, and it's just with the lagging of the video conferencing, it's not really worth it. So go take a look if you so do, please. But I just want to talk about the one last part of it is that at the end, so this is Venerable Rajesh Udam Sarkar, who one night when Claire and I were people watching under the Bodhi tree, I met him and we spoke for about an hour. He was just kind of explaining to me everything going on. And then we exchanged WhatsApps and kind of kept in touch ever since. And he always talks about and sends videos of him doing all this donation work. So I wanted to collect donations for his cause. So I thought the best way to do it would be just to use my Venmo, because I'm thinking a lot of people, or what I would like is just send $1. And if you use Facebook or GoFundMe or a lot of these, they'll take not only a credit card percentage, which is fair to begin with, but then 30 cents per donation, which at that point, it's only 65 of the proceeds are going to end up in India. So I decided to do it that way. Yeah, so when I finished it, I sent the link. For the first 24 hours, I made a private link and sent it to everyone included because I wanted them to see it before I sent it elsewhere. So I sent it to all of them, and then about 15 friends, family, professors, and that's who's seen it so far. And in the first 36 hours, I received $115 to send over there. So I'm gonna wait a couple weeks and hopefully receive more to then send a big lump sum. And I'll definitely have to ask you, Rinzi, for a little help to confirm the wiring and such. But yeah, and then I don't know, I received, oh, I guess our lunch is here. I apologize for that. So yeah, no, I mean, that's really all I have to say. And I hope you guys enjoy it when you watch it. Thank you.
Okay, well done, Max. So it's good we managed to fit this in before lunch.
Yes, yeah.
So who would like to comment to Max? It's difficult, isn't it? I don't know if any of you, have seen, you're getting clapping. I don't know if any of you have seen the film. Ishtar and I have seen it. Yeah, Patricia's seen it, exactly. So we've got, anyway, it's great. And Tashila is the film star, Bob is a film star, Ngawangla.
Yes, there's
yeah. Is it half an hour long? It's 27, 28 minutes.
So it did end up being 25 minutes. So I was stuck between, should I make a 5-minute video that, people actually get through? And I decided, like, for me, I wanted to just create like a full final project that I felt that I included everything that needed to be, and whether people watch it all or not, whatever. Again, I just wanted to create something more complete because, again, this is something that's going to be more lasting and in the ISP library. So I didn't want to just make a soundbite-esque video. But yeah, I was just copying the link, and I'll shoot that in the WhatsApp right when we're done.
Great.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before I was interrupted by the bell. Yeah, no, I was just, if you saw me glancing at my phone during presentations, I've just been receiving emails. I sent it to my advisor who's at Villanova, she's the chair of the philosophy department as well. So she blasted it out to the department. She sent it to media relations. So Villanova Media Relations wants to do some sort of press type thing with it. So, so that's been cool, getting all of that.
No, that's wonderful, Max. Yeah, SAT, I'm sure will love it as well.